Hello, my name is MacLean, and I'm the Water Management Supervisor for the East Bay Regional Park District. And I'm here to talk to you about two cyanobacteria reduction systems and their findings so far, or a tale of two oxygenation systems. I'll start off with a brief history of cyanobacteria and district harmful algal blooms, or HABs, get into recent remediation, then onto our Temescal pilot, and finally to our brand new Lake Anza system. You might have heard of water quality issues and challenges at the two of our swimming reservoirs, Lake Temescal and Lake Anza. Over the years, swimmer's itch, elevated bacteria levels, sewer spills have affected water quality, but since 2014, cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae, has become our biggest challenge. Here are graphs of closure days during the past 7 swim seasons. Some years, we have multiple months of closures due to cyanobacteria. Why are we getting these cyanobacteria blooms? Temescal and Anza are reservoirs. Reservoirs constantly collect sediments and nutrients behind their dams from the surrounding watersheds. This leads to excess nutrients or eutrophication. Temescal, built in 1868, and Anza, built in 1938, have accumulated a lot of nutrients over the years. As these reservoirs fill up, those nutrients become more available to the upper water column where algae can thrive. You can see the yellow spot on this map is Lake Temescal, and the red outline is its watershed. There are 2 freeways and dense neighborhoods within its watershed that contribute to water quality issues. Water quality further suffers from recent droughts. You can see from 2007 to 2010 as it gets pretty red, and from 2012 to 2017 where it gets a lot worse. Reservoirs are stratified into 3 zones. The top, or Epilimnean, is warmer and mixed by the sun and wind. In this zone, the sun fuels primary production of algae and other planktonic species, forming the basis of the aquatic food web. The bottom zone, or Hypolimnean, is cooler. It collects all the nutrient-rich sediments, and in eutrophic reservoirs, hypolimneans are anoxic or oxygen poor. The third zone is the thermocline. It's nestled between the other zones, and in the fall, with lower air temperatures and wind, these zones all mix in what's called a turnover event. The problem with excess nutrients in stratified reservoirs is that without oxygen, problematic chemical reactions readily occur in the hypolimnean. Nutrients like phosphorus in the sediments can be released. In turnover events, or where reservoirs are shallow, these nutrients become available for algae to utilize. This is internal cycling of nutrients, or internal loading. Many say nitrogen drives cyanobacteria production, but phosphorus is needed in much smaller quantities for cyanobacteria to grow. Phosphorus is considered the limiting resource because so little is needed to fuel primary production. Most cyanobacteria remediation focuses on limiting phosphorus availability. In 2015, to understand nutrient loading and eutrophication, our then IPM resource analyst, Pamela Bites, did some baseline water quality monitoring, and then she reached out to her advising professor at Cal State East Bay, Dr. Jean Moran. And together, they recruited a student, Faith Lovelace, who got her master's degree helping us understand Temescal's eutrophic condition. Pamela and Faith showed that abundant nutrients in runoff from the surrounding urban watershed, external loading, was an issue. They also showed that high nutrient cycling from the sediments, internal loading, was also an issue. As you can see from this graph, the deeper you go, the more phosphorus you get, which implies internal loading. By 2016, our IPM specialist Casey Brierly lined up a consultant Wayne Carmichael, who recommended dredging. Since dredging was deemed too expensive, we would have to focus on binding phosphorus. We started monthly monitoring, which has been paying dividends ever since. From 2016 to 2018, to reduce the frequency and intensity of cyanobacteria blooms, we applied phosphorus binding agents at Temescal. These initially worked and held the phosphorus to acceptable levels for a few years, but external nutrient loading continued with winter stormwater runoff and sanitary sewer overflows. Also, our monitoring showed rebounding phosphorus in the sediments, this internal loading, and the cyanobacteria began to respond, though much milder in magnitude. In the meantime, dredging Temescal kept coming up as a longer-lasting remediation strategy, but the cost, scope, and feasibility were so unknown that Becky Tuden, our environmental services manager, acquired some money for an actual Temescal dredging feasibility study. It's probably not a surprise that reasonable options were in the tens of millions of dollars. As we keep being reminded, remediation strategies for cyanobacteria and toxins are expensive and work with varying degrees of success. Back to our internal loading issues, this graph shows a phosphorus spike at the left orange arrow, then two treatments at the blue arrows, and then the orange line peaks again at the red arrow. This shows internal loading. This internal loading in the summer of 2019 meant we were planning another phosphorus binding treatment for spring 2020 when we were approached by a professional colleague and consultant, Eli Kirsch. He had a pilot project in mind. This pilot was a relatively new oxygenation technology called nanobubbles. Like other oxygenation strategies, we want to increase oxygen throughout the water column and reduce the chemical reactions that lead to internal loading. Conventional oxygenation systems release microbubbles that can hold 64 million nanobubbles. Conventional bubbles rise to the surface, whereas nanobubbles meander through the water in what's called Brownian motion, which is much like a dye going through water. This longer residence time is expected to provide more oxygen with less input of resources. In order to gauge the success of the pilot, Eli had worked out a remote, real-time water quality monitoring system. We had the monitoring system installed before the nanobubbler to get baseline conditions. And yes, we could watch our water quality online at any time. Here is the dashboard. This shows the data before the nanobubbler and as the nanobubbler is turned on. We can pick from many water quality parameters and time frames to assess how the system is operating. Of course, you have to size the system to your water body, and due to the space available at Temescal, we had to settle for a smaller than recommended system. Since we can't accommodate a full-size shipping container, we had to settle for 2 trailers, and we are only pumping 150 gallons per minute as opposed to the recommended 200 gallons per minute. We deployed the nanobubbler on August 14, 2020, and like every new piece of equipment, there were a few bumps. Our district electricians were extremely helpful in solving several supply problems and field fitting this new technology to fit our sites. The dashboard comes in handy for assessing progress and identifying issues, but it did take a bit to figure out that a PG&E power outage turned off the oxygen enhancer and the units needed to be reset. We lost 10 days of enhanced oxygenation in mid-October. This can be seen on the left-hand side of the top graph. We can also see the oxygen recovery in that same graph as the slope goes up. Temescal is currently well oxygenated, with the exception of the fouling on the DO sensor at the red arrow. The lower graph shows elevated oxygen reduction potential, or ORP, which keeps chemical reactions in a favorable direction, keeping the phosphorus in the sediments. Smaller blooms of cyanobacteria have occurred during this pilot, but remember, all remediations have their limits. We want to reduce the occurrence and intensity of these blooms. Our pilot is done in December, when we will decide what the next step should be. Back to Lake Anza, in 2015 and 2016, cyanobacteria and toxins caused lengthy swim beach closures, and we knew we wanted to address cyanobacteria at Lake Anza. Anza, like Temescal, is relatively small and entirely owned by the Park District, and therefore it's a good candidate for remediation. Unlike the 4.5 meter Temescal, Lake Anza is 16 meters deep and maintains a thermocline throughout much of the year. The thermocline is good to keep deep, cold water for trout and sequester nutrients that are released from the nutrient-rich sediments due to low oxygen conditions. In 2016, a professional colleague, Alex Horn, reviewed Lake Anza with respect to 17 available lake management techniques and convinced us to work towards a hypolimnetic oxygenation system, or HOS. What is that called? I mentioned the bottom part of the lake is the hypolimnion, therefore hypolimnetic, and oxygenation because we plan to pump oxygen into the anoxic area around the sediments to reduce the internal loading without disturbing the thermocline. This graph illustrates Anza's internal loading. The red arrows point out how the phosphorus line, which is black, climbs up every year. This graph demonstrates 4 years of internal loading. This HOS is designed to fight internal loading like this for years to come. The HOS system proposed in 2016 had multiple construction delays and then COVID delays. That pushed the system completion date to 2020. But during the delays, monthly nutrient monitoring continued, and we deployed temperature and dissolved oxygen sensors at every meter in the deepest part of the lake. This monitoring helped set baselines to assess the lake condition and the HOS success. We finally turned on the Lake Anza HOS on July 28, 2020. Lake Anza was stratified with warm, oxygenated water in the epilimnion above the thermocline and cold, anoxic water in the hypolimnion below the thermocline. We turned on the oxygen with our HOS to oxygenate that anoxic water and reduce the amount of nutrients available. With the deployment of the HOS, we began weekly profiles along with our monthly nutrient monitoring. This weekly monitoring helped us assess the HOS performance. Our fisheries biologist too, Ed Culver, also began downloading our temperature and dissolved oxygen loggers monthly. This graph is from our temperature loggers, and they really illustrate how lakes stratify in the summer, when the algae and other plant species are growing. Note the red arrow. Do you see where the lines separate? These are different temperatures at different depths of the lake. When the temperature levels come together in the winter at the blue arrow, this illustrates how the lake has mixed its different levels and strata. You can see the lake mixing on this graph. This is the turnover event that we all anticipate every fall. The weekly depth profile monitoring is how we assess the progress and discovered an incident, a lake turnover. The graph on the left is from August 3rd, where most of the temperatures are around 17 degrees C. The graph on the right is the following week. Here, the 11 temperature readings are almost all 19 degrees C. The stratification degraded and lake mixed. This was a concern. Warmer water stresses out trout who prefer cold water. Fortunately, the oxygenated warm water did not appear to stress or cause a trout kill. Why did this happen in August instead of November? We did have a strange cold spell in August with gusty winds. Note August 5th at the red arrow. The orange line is the wind, and it's almost 20 miles an hour on the day the lake turned over. And the blue line is the air temperature. The air temperature is its lowest at August 5th as well. These conditions may have facilitated a small turnover or mixing event, but we think that the energy from the bubbles released from the HOS were a factor in the turnover as well. Here's a continuation of our temp logger graph. This HOS installation is at the blue arrow, followed by the lake turnover where the depths become the same temperature at the red arrow. When we identified the turnover, we responded quickly by turning down the HOS in hopes that the lake would restratify. Unfortunately, after this turnover, nutrients from the hypolimnean were mixed throughout the lake, and cyanobacteria became noticeably worse, as did the filamentous algae. To this day, the lake has not restratified, and the cyanobacterial biomass continues. To get rid of the cyanobacteria bloom, we would have to treat the bloom with an algicide or wait for the bloom to die out naturally. Colder temperatures, shorter days, and rain will help with that. But without pressure of swimming due to COVID-19, we can play the waiting game and allow the lake to restratify naturally. This is a logger graph of oxygen in the lake at the different depths. The HOS has already oxygenated the lake above 7 milligrams per liter, which is good. Note the red area is at 7 milligrams per liter, and we are currently at 11 milligrams per liter. And when the lake restratifies in the spring, the HOS should be able to maintain oxygen in the hypolimnean and limit phosphorus availability for next year's growing season. That leads us to the summary of our oxygen remediation. We installed 2 different oxygen systems in 2020. Monitoring is very important to understand if you're heading in the right direction and to identify if something's going wrong. Real-time monitoring is really cool, but really expensive, and it's probably worth the investment. The Nanobubbler pilot is a relatively inexpensive system and off to a good start. Our pilot will be over soon. Then we'll have to decide where we go. The HOS is finally installed after 4 years, but it's off to a rocky start with the lake turnover. We will be monitoring its progress closely in the future to avoid premature turnovers. Understanding cyanobacteria, HABs, and remediation has been a very involved process over the past 6 years. Matt Grawl and I had a good start in developing cyanobacteria monitoring at our lakes and swim beaches, but our HABs task force really got outreach and remediation projects going. There's been so many quality efforts, collaborations, and field days. I'm really, really proud of our team. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Hal, I don't see any questions in the chat on this topic right now. So, now here one just came in from Gene from Cal State East Bay. So, Gene, thanks for being here, and glad to have you here. So, how can you see that question?
Yeah. Do you see any spatial variation of any of the monitored parameters within Temescal and Anza? Or are they monitored only at one location? At Temescal right now for the Nanobubbler, we have three locations, one lower and one upper on the north side, and one lower on the middle of the lake. And they're pretty good at showing things, but at Lake Anza we've got, what is it, 16 sondes that do temperature and oxygen, and so we can make those graphs that really show how the stratification happens and when we get the turnovers. So we do have, and then weekly at Anza, we're doing depth measurements, and we're doing that every 2 weeks over at Temescal.
I can also comment that we don't see a huge amount of spatial variation because they're relatively small lakes. with respect to all the parameters that we collect. So we're really a little bit more interested in the depth profiles, particularly at Anza, given its depth. But we will see some seasonal variations spatially with respect to phosphorus inputs directly after storms, as well as when we take algae sampling with cyanobacteria. We're looking at chlorophyll A. There are definitely spots in the lake that tend to have a lot more chlorophyll A, and that's primarily due to, I believe, wind and the geography of the lake.
And who was just speaking?
That was Pamela.
That was Pamela.
No, I know. Pam bites.
Sorry.
Bites. Pam's our IPM specialist. Sorry, I was kidding. I wanted the group to know who it was. Hal, so now there's several more questions coming in.
Okay.
So it says, lots of monitoring data inform our analysis of the treatments. When will we evaluate the Temescal pilot? And when do we think Anza results will improve?
Well, the pilot, we'll be assessing that in the next couple of weeks here. The pilot's over in December. And I think the conditions in Anza will improve with rainy days like now. We're already seeing it start to break up. But what's really helping is all the oxygen in the lake is helping kind of break that down a little bit. But when the lake re-stratifies in the spring, we should have good oxygen throughout the entire lake, along with the stratification, which will keep the cold water for the trout. And the extra oxygen should really help kind of keep the phosphorus in the sediments, and hopefully will just reduce the cyanobacteria, the occurrence, and the intensity of those blooms.
Okay. So thanks, Hal. So we've got a couple more questions, and so we're just acknowledging we're right now we're kind of in the scheduled break time, and so we're going to keep answering a few of these questions, but we'll look. The next presentation is going to start around 11:05. So if you're not interested in this, you can take a break, and if you want to hear the answers, we'll keep going for a little bit, and we expect the next presentation to start in about 10 minutes. So I see Bert Mulcahy from East Bay Mud. Bert, thanks for the question. We're using liquid oxygen at Lake Anza. So, and so we've got a tank, and it's actually been interesting with the tank and the deliveries. We've actually had some challenges with the oxygen system because there's been a high demand for oxygen from other entities, hospitals and other things during this time. And so we have had a little bit of a challenge at times with those deliveries in the supply chain, but we haven't had any major issue yet, but it's concerning. Okay, so then, okay, some of these are getting answered, and so I'm losing them.
Neil asked about the duckweed at Temescal. And do we think the uptake of nutrients by duckweed will reduce availability to cyanobacteria? I'm not so sure about that. I think we kind of have a annual duckweed issue, and I think that I think there's probably enough nutrients in the lake to satisfy a duckweed bloom and the cyanobacteria bloom. Probably more of the issue is if the duckweed dies out or the cyanobacteria dies out, and then you have a bunch of nutrients available for more cyanobacteria blooms. But hopefully these nanobubbles and all the and the oxygen will help kind of sequester the internal loading and reduce these blooms.
Yeah, and so Hal, the next one is, is asking what is the likelihood of being able to successfully manage HABs in these reservoirs using oxygenation technologies without a larger dredging project? And then also, are these technologies being widely used? I would say the hypolimnetic oxygen system, yes, that is being used in other areas, but the nanobubbler is brand new in a pilot. So, but Hal, what do you think about how long this will work without a dredging project?
Well, I think that I think these are all tools, and I think that that these oxygenation systems, along with sequestering phosphorus, might be enough to stave off, you know, a larger dredging project. I mean, with that dredging feasibility study is pretty expensive, and it's pretty invasive on the entire park. I'd be interested to see if we could even do something like that. But other areas and lakes have managed with oxygenation systems and like Phoslock or alum treatments.
I think
Yeah,
one,
I think that's what we're seeing. I think the challenge is going to be that it's going to take constant operation and maintenance and a lot of ongoing monitoring to keep those systems, you know, managing the nutrients. And it'll work for a while, but I think at some point it could become challenging. And Pam, I think you want to add something, and then I think Pam, you're going to answer the next question too.
sure. I just wanted to say that currently the sediment input to Temescal is greater than we have the ability and the permits to remove. So ultimately, Temescal continues to fill up. So in order for any kind of oxygenation system at Temescal to work, we have to stop the net input of sediments.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it'll continue to get more shallow.
That's a good point, and that's the point. There is going to be some diminishing return, and at some point, even if we can maintain the water quality, the depth is going to become so shallow that it will impact other things. So at some point, these would lose their efficacy over time. And so, I mean, we could look at those rates and determine what that lifespan would be. I mean, it's probably decades, but Temescal is filling in still, as Pam mentioned. So Pam, the next question was from Mike at Big Break, and to what scale might these, what water body size depth might these methods work? Like it's really a question about like Big Break as an open area versus a closed system like Anza and Temescal.
Yeah, that's a really great question.
Relatively.
Big Break is a huge system that I don't believe in all of our you know, all of our explorations, we've ever seen a system that works in such a large open system like Big Break would be. Each system, each lake, relatively closed, has a different approach based on its bathymetry, its the structure or the geometry of its basin, its watershed inputs, the geology that it sits in, and also its surrounding use. So the remediation options are varied and diverse, and each is very specifically designed for that particular watershed. Big Break is just a huge system, and I honestly have never heard of any system that would be appropriate for something like that. Not to mention the fact that we share those waters with so many other regulatory agencies. That's a big ask. But we'll still keep working on those aquatic weeds, Mike, I promise. Were there any other questions, Matt, that you wanted to answer before we go to break?
Yeah, there's one more from Heather DeQuincy, and it just says, how do you anticipate that when swimming returns to the lakes, there will be an effect on these treatments?
I think by the time swimming returns to those lakes, these systems should be able to take care of the internal load or the loading from the swimmers. I don't know. I anticipate that they would. I mean, they use these in other lakes with swimming, and I think that I'm hopeful that it would improve conditions for swimming, and I'm hopeful that we will have a swimming season next year.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, is that they should improve water quality for the swimmers, and I don't think the swimmers would have any effect on the oxygenation input into the system. Should be negligible. So thanks for all the good questions. So we will go kind of silent and maybe dark for about 5 minutes here.